In this webinar, I'm going to be looking at the communication of the story. In the previous webinars, we've been looking at how we find the story, how we look for patterns, how we work with qualitative information. But obviously, what we have to do is to make sure that we generate an outcome. And to do that, we need to communicate the story. And here we go. So this webinar and the previous two webinars are all part of a project to publish a book sometime this year. And it's been provisionally titled Finding and Communicating the Story in the Data. The agenda for today is just a quick reminder about the story finding framework that I've adopted, why we need to understand the outcome, the do. What is it that we expect the presentation to cause to happen or to help to happen? Some thoughts about context and why we use stories, and then a mechanism that I feel is really powerful, which is the think, feel, do. Some thoughts about practice and about rehearse. And then I'm going to be talking about why you need to follow up your presentation. And then we can take questions and answers. So the framework that I use for all of these webinars and for the courses that I run in how to find and communicate the story is this framework. And we're going to be focusing on the last two steps, communicate the story and the follow-up. So whilst every step in the framework is important, the two most important are the one at number one, defining the problem. Because if you're not answering the real problem, then it's a waste of time and money. And the final one, which is equally important, is did you communicate the story in a way that allowed a decision to be made, an action to be taken? Because if you didn't do that, it doesn't matter how good everything else was. It's still wasted time, money and effort. There should always be a do. What is it that the research we've done is going to enable the sponsor of the research, the person paying for the research, the end client, the stakeholder, to be able to do better? Now, what do I mean by the do? Well, it might be that we're going to recommend, yes, launch the product. It might be that we've been looking at several options and we are going to recommend choosing option A. It might be that we've been looking at a hotel chain and we say what you need to do is address customer dissatisfaction with the check-in process. Sometimes we will say you need to do more research. We've found that there is a real problem with this group. We can't at this stage tell you how you should remedy the problem, so what you need to do is this research to find out how to remedy the problem. Sometimes, unfortunately, we have to say, cancel the project. This is a non-starter. This doesn't work. You've got something fundamentally wrong here. And other times, the do is carry on doing exactly what you are doing. That is also a do, where we're telling people, yep, you're on the right track. What you need to do is more of the same. Now, the context is massively important in terms of how we communicate the idea. The story's got to tell the client what needs to be known in order to do what needs to be done in ways that the client is able to believe and able to interpret. It doesn't matter if you think the communication is right. If the communication doesn't change the mind of the person whose mind it needs to be changed, if they don't feel able to believe it, if they can't interpret it, if they can't use it, then it's wrong. So, what are the factors that determine this context? We need to understand what is already known, what is believed, and what is predicted. Those of you who have seen all of the webinars will know that at the problem definition stage, I typically get people to make predictions about what the outcome is going to be. And if at the end of the research I'm telling them, yes, your predictions were right, that's a fairly straightforward communication process. If on the other hand, I find out that their predictions were wrong, then I know I have a more difficult communication problem. My context is different. I'm going to think about it in a different way. How important are the results perceived to be? And one of the comparisons that I draw here is with the financial accounts. If you ever go to a senior level meeting, perhaps you observe part of a board meeting or something like that, you'll see them going over the financial accounts. And these are often really boring. They're laid out in simple tabular format, and people read them really closely because they're perceived to be, and they are, massively important. Frequently, research data is not seen to be so important, so it has to be more engaging. It has to grab people's attention. They're not going to work so hard to find the information themselves. How complicated is the message? If we've tested 3 bottles and one of them is the clear winner, that's not very complicated. So it's not going to generate a really complicated communication or a deep story. But if we identify that there is a cultural mismatch between the people running the company and the people who are their customers, and that mismatch stems from a complex misunderstanding of cultural values, then we have a much more challenging communication problem, an education problem, where we need to get this information across in ways that are able to be believed, able to be understood, and able to be acted on. We need to really be clear about what do people need to understand. We need to think about what do they need to remember and what can they look up later. If you think about a 30-minute presentation, people can probably remember 4 or 5 numbers or 1 or 2 numbers depending on who they are. There might be 20 numbers which are quite important, so those numbers they have to remember to be able to look them up. That is one of the key things that we need to communicate. What is it that they really need to understand to make a better business decision is vital. And we need to think about, is it good news or is it bad news? And I'll come back to this point later. If they have developed a new idea, they really want it to be successful, they spent 18 months working on it, we test it, and it's great. People really want to buy it. That's an easy presentation. We don't go into the presentation and the client is pointing their finger at us saying, I don't believe you. You asked the wrong people. You asked the wrong questions. You've done the wrong analysis. So that's good news. If on the other hand, it's the same scenario, they've worked on it for 18 months, they've invested a lot of their credibility with the company, and we discover that it's a real lemon. It should be scrapped. It's a terrible idea. That's bad news. People are going to find it much harder to believe us. So we are going to have a quite different process to communicate that information in a way that makes it able for them to believe it, makes it able for them to understand it, and make them able to take the right decisions. And we need to know what format the communication is going to be in. Is it a face-to-face presentation? Is it a Zoom or Teams presentation? Is it a written report? Is it simply an email of the key findings? All of those have got different strengths and different weaknesses in how we're going to communicate the findings. And we should also know, are there any rules the client has? I remember working with one client who actually had rules about what font you could use in the presentation. I had another client who insisted that we could never use the word problem. We had to use the word opportunity. And of course, inside that company, the word opportunity was understood to mean problem. But you need to know what the rules are. I remember working for one major drinks manufacturer who used to object to their main competitor being named. They wanted them just called the competitor. Whatever the rules are, you're going to follow them most of the time. So this point about it being good news or bad news. So if the message is straightforward, if it's going to be understood, if it's going to be believed, then the story can be really simple and we're going to deliver it in that way. But if it's bad news, then we have to work much harder to get it across. It will not normally be possible to get bad news across in a single meeting or in a single report. It's normally a process where we go through and we talk to them and we get them to understand, and they, whoever we're presenting the bad news to, should have an opportunity to ask us to do alternative analyses. We should be able to take them through those analyses to show that why this finding is correct, why it is bad news, but it's correct bad news. So why do we use stories? Stories are incredibly popular at the moment. Well, they help deliver the do. The reason we're using stories is to generate an outcome. It's not because we want to be entertaining. It's not because we want to be engaging. We probably do, but that is not the reason. The reason is they help deliver the outcome. How do they do that? They make the message easier to understand. It's not a set of facts. It's not a shopping list of ideas. They're easier to be engaged with. People have lots of distractions. They've probably got their mobile phone turned on during the presentation. They may even have their computer open and be answering email. You want to be able to engage them with this information. It's easier to remember when we put it in the form of stories, and it is more likely to change minds. Sometimes you'll hear people say that every presentation should change people's minds. Well, of course, that's not true. If the presentation says what you're doing now is absolutely right, all you're doing is making people a little bit more confident in what they were doing anyway. But often you do need to change people's minds. And in that case, a story is a much more powerful way of doing it. So I'm going to give you an example, and this is from one of my favourite books by Chip and Dan Heath, Made to Stick. And so I've taken this example about USA movie popcorn. So back in the 90s, a study was done, and it found that an average sized bag of popcorn in the USA at that time contained 37 grams of saturated fat. The government at the time recommended that people try to limit the saturated fat they consume to 20 grams a day. So they could do a chart to show the difference. But that really wouldn't convey a message in the sort of powerful way that they wanted to. So what they did was they called a press conference and they put on the table a medium-sized bag of popcorn, and they had some other things on the table and they were covered with a cloth, and they removed the cloth to show a fried breakfast, a McDonald's lunch, and a steak with all trimmings dinner. And they said that is also 37 grams of saturated fat. One medium-sized bag of popcorn at that time was equivalent to 3 unhealthy meals in terms of saturated fat. That is storytelling. It's going straight to emotion. It's not working at the level of 37 grams. It's working at the level of, my God, I wouldn't eat all 3 of those meals in one day. And now I'm doing it in one bag of popcorn. Following all the fuss that came around following this, the popcorn was reconstituted. It was made with different fats. It had a much lower fat content because it was a successful campaign, and the success was built on the science being communicated well by leveraging emotion through storytelling. And we'll come back to this example later in the presentation. We need to answer the business questions. So one of the earlier webinars was all about identifying what is the business question, not just the research question, but the business question. So imagine this as a business question. I live in the UK. Imagine it's 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm in my office in the centre of Nottingham, and at 3 p.m. I have a meeting in London at the British Library. How should I get there? Well, that's a very straightforward business question. All of the data that is needed to answer that question is available online. It's available in printed timetables. So there is no problem with collecting information that is capable of answering that business question. But this is one of my favourite quotes from Michelangelo when they said, "How did you know how to carve the statue of David?" And he said, "It was simple. I removed everything in the rock that was not David." And we need to remove everything in the data that is not the answer. People don't want additional stuff, they want the answer. So, we've got two ways we could answer this business question. The first way would be simply to give somebody the timetable and say what you're looking for is in that data set. And this is what a lot of market research was like 20, 30 years ago. You'd hand over, here are the data tables, it will answer your question for you. Or we could hand over a piece of information like this. Walk to Nottingham Station, which is 10 minutes away, catch the 12:45 train to London, and that's a direct train. It arrives in London at 2:25. The British Library is across the road from the station, approximately 5 minutes away. So we have now generated an itinerary. An itinerary is the answer to this. It's not a set of data points. We've added in additional information which isn't in the train timetable, like the British Library is across the road from the station. So that is what we're looking for when we're trying to pull this information together. Which leads us to the question, well, when is the timetable the right answer? And it's the right answer when you don't have a clear business question. If you are producing a report that's going to be used by lots of different people in the organisation to answer lots of different questions, then you have to organise that information in a way that makes it accessible so that somebody else can find the story from that information. This is why most trade and industry reports are not great stories. What they are, when they're done well, is an accessible set of information that allows secondary analysis which will generate storytelling. So I've mentioned before that what we're talking about here is the difference between means and ends. Engagement, storytelling, visualization are not ends, they are means. The end that we're looking to create is an outcome, is action, it's a decision by the decision maker. That is what we're focused on. Everything else is a method of making that happen. And I mentioned this combination here, the think, feel, do. So the think relates to the facts, to the information we've collected. Feel is the emotional message, because the emotional message is what normally creates the do, the actions that we want to happen. We find the do by combining together the business question with the business context and the data and analysis that we are conducting. And in combination, they generate the do. But the do is not a super simple thing, because if we are trying to change people's minds, if we are trying to change behaviour, it is hard. So this is a photograph I took a few years ago outside an apartment I was staying in Tokyo, in Japan. Japanese people are incredibly law-abiding and they follow the rules by and large. But here, every single day, there were lots of bicycles propped up by the no bicycle parking sign. And I kind of think about what's going on in the mind of the local government official. At first, maybe they put up the sign in Japanese, no cycle parking. And you know what? Lots of bicycles are still parked there. So whoever is in charge of it thinks, okay, they don't understand the message. Maybe they are not Japanese. So I'll put the message in English. And what happens is people keep parking their bicycles there. Okay, maybe they can't read Japanese or English, so I will put the message there as a visualization with a bicycle and a red circle round it and a red stripe across it. And still people are parking the bicycles. So the local government official thinks, maybe they didn't notice the sign. So it's orange with a white section and some bright red bits. So I'll put a blue flag and write on that in a different orientation, no bicycle parking. And what is wrong is that the local government official in this story is thinking that the message is not being understood. The problem is people don't feel they need to obey that message. The The problem isn't one of comprehension. The person making the message doesn't need to say it more clearly or say it more often or say it in a louder voice. They need to make people believe the message needs to be obeyed. That's why changing behaviour is hard. We need to convey our messages in a way that people are more likely to believe, and that is because they feel the decision is right. They feel our recommendation is right. So if we come back to the concept of System 1 and System 2 and how we change behaviour, sometimes people talk about the rider and the elephant. So we need to inform the rider, the System 2. This is where the thinking process goes on. But we need to motivate the elephant, the emotional part of the process. And we need to shape the path. We need to make it easier to do the right thing. The shift from opting in to opting out is all about shaping the path. It by and large does not change what people want the outcome to be, but it makes it more likely that their motivation is fine. They get the outcome they want because the path has been shaped. And we need to adopt all of those in what we do. So how do we work with the think? Well, we don't start with the data and the analysis. We start with the business question. And that was the point in the first of these webinars. Really look at what is the business problem? What are we trying to solve? Then the business context. What is already known? What are the limitations? What are the predictions? Then we combine our data analysis, other people's data, and we end up with the think. And when we do that analysis, we determine what the do should be. On the basis of the information we've gathered, the quantitative and the qualitative information, we form a clear recommendation. The recommendation is a do. So the do is defined by the think. But as we can see, there is a missing gap in this pyramid. How are we going to get the do to happen? We are going to try to generate a feeling that the recommendation is right. When our clients, our stakeholders, the people paying for the research receive the story, it makes them feel that the recommendation is correct. That is what we're looking to achieve. So think. These facts are still important from the sort of people we are. They're the platform that everything else is built on. People very rarely change their beliefs or their behaviour because of facts. Changes happen at the emotional level. So we need to work with that. And every story should be aimed at creating an outcome, an action that the teller of the story wants the recipient to do. So let's go back to that example of the movie popcorn. What was going on here was that there was the data, 37 grams, 20 grams, and that was the emotional level. It's 3 meals worth of saturated fat. So if we look at that in terms of think, feel, do, the facts, popcorn has got saturated fat. Saturated fat is not good for you. There are limits in how much you should have of it. We want people to feel that 3 junk meals in one day is dumb or it's gross. And so we have the do. We want people, when they're about to buy that popcorn, to think about all the fat, to feel a bit sick or feel a bit scared and buy something else. The story has also got robust simplification, because when messages are passed around the company, they can often become simplified, and that sometimes changes their meaning. We want messages that when you simplify them have the same meaning. So movie popcorn data, it's about double your daily fat allowance. So that's a fairly robust, much better than 37 grams and 20 grams. Visual story is a day's worth of unhealthy food. That is really powerful, and it's a very straightforward message. I mentioned Michelangelo and leaving stuff out. So what was left out of this story? Well, there are other things in popcorn which are not good for you. Salt and sugar. If we talk about the other things in popcorn that are not good for you, we would reduce the impact of talking about the fat. The more things you talk about, the less impact any one of them has. We could have talked about large bags of popcorn, but it wasn't necessary. There was a nice feature that a medium bag makes a whole day's worth of unhealthy food. There are other things eaten in movie theatres and cinemas that are not good for you. Hot dogs and ice creams and chocolates. Again, if the communication had talked about those, it would have reduced the impact of the popcorn communication. They could have compared it with other things, like compared with a normal meal. But that is unnecessary. Pick a clear message and stick with it. So what we're trying to do with this story finding and storytelling and communicating is separate the signal from the noise. Now, what do I mean by signal? Anything that answers the business question or helps us communicate the answer is signal. Anything else is noise. So noise isn't error. Noise isn't scratchy noises. Noise is anything that is not helping communicate the answer. So here's an example taken from aeroplanes and airports. If you imagine that you're an air traffic controller, then information about the height of planes, the speed of planes, and their current heading is all signal. Noise are things like the airline, how many people are on the plane, where did the plane take off from? You are interested in where did the plane enter your space from, and where is it going to leave your space, but where it took off and where it's going to land are not nearly so important. But now let's imagine you're the immigration manager at the airport. The height, the speed and the heading are noise to you. What you're interested in is which airline, because that tells you a lot about the processes you're going to have put in place. How many people on board is important, because that tells you how many gates to have open. And origin, where this plane is coming from, tells you a lot about how you're going to deal with the people arriving. So the same facts can be signal or noise depending on who you are, context, what the story is, context, and whether it's good news or bad news. So just going to highlight one or two storytelling devices that are going to help us communicate these ideas more clearly. The first is narrative flow. And many people think narrative flow is actually what storytelling is, or it's more important than storytelling. It is certainly very important. Your communication needs to flow like a stream that moves from a source to a destination. It mustn't jump around. It mustn't play mental games where people are going to lose track or they don't know where it's going. So that's where we get to a beginning and a middle and an end. That flow should be linear. You don't want to take people down a route and then say, but that's a red herring. Most senior execs go ballistic if they find out you've wasted 5 minutes of their time by going down a red herring route. The direction of the presentation should make sense at all stage. Telling people, don't worry, it'll all make sense in a few minutes, only occasionally works, and it only works for a few talented presenters with a few talented receivers of messages. In most cases, it's a disaster. Use storytelling devices, so humour, personal anecdotes, interaction. When I said remove everything that's unnecessary, storytelling devices are not unnecessary. They are part of what makes the message stick, makes it work. So what are the key elements? You want to be linking to the project objectives all the time. So that is where we get the need to know, not the nice to know. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about nice to knows later. We want to be looking for patterns or themes in the data, not a single data point. It by and large isn't reliable enough. If we find a single data point that's really interesting, but we can't support it from the rest of our data, we'll go and look for some other data. Things that have been published, previous studies, whatever, to make sure it's a robust point. We want clear findings. So ideally, you want to group your information together so it's a large group of people. Even better if they can be majorities. So for example, if men are slightly more interested in something you're testing, and if younger people are slightly more interested in it, and if people in Mumbai are slightly more interested in it, have a look at a cell that's made up of young men in Mumbai, because that may be a really strong message. We may go from 20% of younger people like it, 20% of people in Mumbai like it, 25% of men like it. And when we look at young men in Mumbai, maybe it's 55% of those who like it. That might be the real key driver in all that information. So keep regrouping your information to see if you can find the essence of what's happening. And then you want to do the elevator pitch or the lead. But back in the days of newspapers, the lead was that bit in bold at the top of the article that told you why you should read this. It's probably closer now to being the clickbait that makes you want to read an article in social media. And this is a wonderful story that Nora Ephron used to tell. She was obviously a screenwriter. She did When Harry Met Sally and Sleepless in Seattle. But before that, she was a journalist. Grew up in California, went to the Beverly Hills School of Journalism. And on the first day there, she tells the story. They were taught about the 5 W's. Who, what, when, where and why. Really useful principles for market researchers. They were also taught about the lead. This single sentence that grabs people's attention, that makes them want to read everything. They were then asked by the teacher to write the lead for the school newspaper, the newspaper that went to all of the students. And here was the story, and they had to write a lead for this story. The entire school faculty will travel to Sacramento next Thursday for a colloquium in new teaching methods. Among the speakers will be anthropologist Margaret Mead, college president Dr. Robert Maynard Hutchins, and California Governor Edmund Brown. So they all started typing, and they tended to write about the 5 W's. Who was doing, what was happening, when was it happening, where was it happening, and why were they going there? And the teacher went down collecting all the submissions, and they said good but wrong, good not right. And then he said, okay, let me tell you what the lead is. The lead for the student newspaper is no school next Thursday. For the readers, for the students, the most important thing about this piece of news is that all the school faculty will not be here next Thursday. So there will be no school next Thursday. That is what we need to draw out from this. So sometimes the most important conclusion, the most important finding from the data isn't in the data, it's the consequence of the data. And we need to bear that in mind. Similarly, we want to be thinking about useful advice, not precision. So here's a nice picture which I borrowed from the internet. Back when I started in market research in the 1970s, we would be so much on that left-hand side, trying to calculate ever more accurately how heavy is this weight that's falling towards you, and exactly how fast is it travelling. What we should be doing is asking people to move out of the way of the falling weight. That is what we're supposed to be doing, not getting more accurate at measuring the weight and the speed that it's moving at. Once we know it's enough to kill you or injure you, it's time to focus on the move rather than the detail. So, in most cases, in nearly all cases, don't present the results in the sequence you collected them. So that means not presenting them in questionnaire order. I frequently see people turn up at a presentation and they'll do question 1 before question 2 before question 3. The order of the attributes will be the same order they were presented in the questionnaire, and that is nearly always the wrong order. You want to find a flow that helps you tell the story. That means you're going to rank them by importance or by difference or by impact or by something that makes the story easier to understand, it makes it more memorable, it helps amplify the point. So here is some data that I downloaded about the coronavirus back in 2020. And I downloaded two sets of data, two pieces of information. One was deaths per million of population, and one was cases per million of population. And so I've got them on different scales, obviously. One's on a scale on the left, one's on a scale on the right. And when you download that sort of information, it comes down in alphabetical order because that makes it easier for you to find it. So it's really a good idea for the people providing that data to make it available in alphabetical order. You really wouldn't want it in some sort of pre-sorted order if you want to be able to identify it. But it's really hard to look at that and see any patterns. If we simply rank the data by deaths per million, then we see which countries had at that point far more deaths per million, which countries had far fewer deaths per million. The world becomes a nice reference point, so we know that half of the population of the whole world, not of the data in this set, is to the left and half is going to be to the right. But now we can see something very interesting as well about cases. In terms of the world, we can see that because of the two scales, the number of cases lines up with the number of deaths. And this is also true for Brazil, it's true for the USA, it's broadly true for South Africa, for Germany and Japan. It's not true for UK, Italy, Sweden and France. We can look at that and very clearly see it looks like at that point those countries were under-identifying cases because they had far more deaths and far fewer cases in ratio than other countries. So that becomes potentially, depending on who we're reporting to, an interesting part of the story. It's much easier to see when we sort by something meaningful. Now, in terms of structure, one of my favourite starting points is one that's been made popular by Mike Sherman. It's in his book. It's in at least two presentations on the NewMR website. And it's a method of coming up with a very straightforward, very powerful structure that you might want to use as your starting position. So let's imagine it's a slide deck. The first slide is the elevator pitch, or what I'm calling the lead. What is the key point? The next slide is the executive summary, and it's going to mention 3 themes. I don't care if you've got 10 themes. People, by and large, are only going to remember 3. Pick the 3 you want to, because if you give people 10, they will choose which 3 to remember. So you choose which 3 are going to be remembered. Those are your 3 themes. And you can do, as the British Prime Minister did a few years ago, and it was Tony Blair, and he said, my 3 themes are education, education, education. Repetition and 3s work really powerfully, certainly with the Western mind. Then talk about theme 1 and provide 3 pieces of evidence. And not just 3 pieces of evidence, but I would say make one of those a quantitative piece of evidence. Make one of those a qualitative piece of evidence. And make one of those a visually understandable piece of evidence. So you're appealing to different mindsets in your audience. Don't just say the same thing multiple times. Say the same thing in different ways multiple times. Then your second theme with 3 pieces of evidence. Your third theme with 3 pieces of evidence. Close all that with your recommendations, and your recommendation should be a clear call to action, a do. And everything else goes in the treasure chest, which some people call the appendices. I think we undersell the value of the appendices. They are fantastic, but they're not part of the presentation. My recommendation to people is you start with this sort of structure. You tweak it as you find necessary to make it more storytelling and more emotional. If you have a client who insists that you have 5 pieces of evidence for everything, fine, they're the client. But for the next client, go back to your preferred structure. And this, I think, is a really good preferred structure. So I'm just coming back to this point now about good news and bad news. Normally, when we do a piece of work, we've got one of four alternatives. It's either just good news, or it's good news, but there are a few things you need to keep an eye on. It's bad news, but there are some options. Okay, it's not going to be suitable for the whole market, but it's going to be great online. It's not suitable for the whole market, but the youth market is going to really like it. And then there is just bad news. This is a really bad idea. You should be stopping it and not moving forward. And the storytelling is different for all of those. Good news and bad news, of course, is defined by what the client wanted or expected, and then what the research finds. So you might initially think that something was good news, but actually when you start talking to the client, you realise they wanted even better news. Or you might think that this is not very encouraging, but when you talk to them, you realise this is better than the disaster they were expecting. So you really need to know about expectations. If it's bad news, you often want to think about the 5 stages of grief. So they're going to start off quite often by being angry and then denying, and then by bargaining, by saying things like, well, if we launched it at a lower price and then brought the price back up, depression and acceptance. It's incredibly rare that one presentation or one report would really deliver bad news in a way that the audience felt it was right. They felt that this was the truth and that they feel they should act on these findings. And facts are almost never enough to persuade somebody. Emotions are the key. Now, one really good example of how you can leverage emotions is a customer video. You do some analysis, you find out there is a problem with the satisfaction with this new type of packaging. See if you can find a video of somebody trying to use the packaging and becoming visibly upset because they can't work it out. That is going to convey the emotion of the problem much more clearly than your text and your data. And quite often I find it's useful to go back to a point where the expectations match the findings and build from there. So maybe we've tried to develop the market. We've done some research about a new type of golf club. And we say to them, okay, we've got the research now. We'd like to talk to you about the people who liked it. Well, the people who liked it most were these people. And they liked it because of this and this and this. However, this group is only 5% of the whole marketplace. The next group that are quite interesting with this group here who really quite liked it, but they can't afford it, so they're not going to buy it, and they're 20% of the marketplace. The next group thought it was okay, but it didn't meet their expectations on this, so they're unlikely to buy it, and they are 30%. So we're building the picture up, and we've started with the people they most expected to see first, and the problem is that's a small group of people. And then hopefully we can build up their understanding of the whole marketplace as we go forward. The sorts of devices that play to emotions are things like analogies. So one analogy is explaining a joke is like dissecting a frog. You understand it better, but the frog dies in the process. Emily, when they were pitching the film Alien, they described it, it's like Jaws, but in space. Just get into the essence of it. When they were pitching YouTube, they said it's like Flickr, but for videos. And these days, of course, we'd probably almost turn that round and say it's like YouTube, but for photos, if we were trying to describe Flickr. This was one that did the rounds a few years ago. AI and big data is like high school sex. Everybody is talking about it, but nobody is actually doing it. So when I saw a presentation that talked at the percentage of projects that have led to a successful return on investment, they had very little impact. But when a speaker said this, it kind of suddenly, oh yes, I know what that means. I feel like that's right. As opposed to, I believe those data points you're telling me are right. We can use visual metaphors as well, or analogies. So this is one that the World Wildlife Foundation did using Jenga. And if you pull one piece out, the whole system falls down. So again, trying to make people think about the concepts rather than the numbers, the data and the details. Can you turn your results into memes? So if we take this very popular one down at the bottom, maybe the partner on the right in the blue top is your existing service provider. The guy in the check shirt is the client, and the woman in the red top is the DIY platform, and we can see the client looking round at the DIY platform. Hasn't lost his love of the full service option, but he's attracted momentarily by the DIY option. Things like that are going to help get your message through the business, but they have to be really simple to turn into memes. You can't have, and here are 55 points describing why this is the case. Try to collect your own battery of examples. So this is one that I downloaded off the internet. It's a really useful example when we talk about the difference between design and real usage. So the data may show us the difference, but then we want to articulate that difference. Here is a sign I saw in Auckland years ago, and I am really good these days at taking photos, which I think might be useful later on. And this is just a nice way of explaining where we have a communication problem and why something isn't working right. I want to as well highlight the need to practice and rehearse. So this soccer player here is practicing. They will never play a match where there are cones on the pitch and they have to dribble the ball through the cones. This gives them ball handling skills. So when we see Pecha, when we have internal presentations, those are about practice. They're about improving your skills, going on presentation courses, going on story finding courses. All of that is practice, and it will make you better at the skills. But then we have the rehearsal, where you actually go through the presentation you're going to make and you rehearse it. You should never, ever go to a client, deliver a rehearsal, and it's the first time that you've done that. You should rehearse that in advance with colleagues out loud, where you're actually saying the words to make sure that it's the right length, that it's clear, that the audience can understand it, that you can actually say all of those words. I have been in situations where people have got up to start presenting and they've got to a particular phrase and they've started to stumble over it. I remember someone presenting about the chrysanthemum, which is the flower of Japan, only to discover that in their mind they could say it, but when they were on the stage, they could not say it. I've seen a similar thing with neuro-linguistic programming. Somebody had been using it for a while. They could say it in their mind. When they tried to say it out loud, they struggled. Little things like that, and then big things like that concept doesn't come across when you talk about it like that. You need an audience to listen to you to say, that works, that does not work. And then you really need to follow up your story. You need to find out why it worked, why it didn't work, how did it work, when are they going to implement it. You might want to follow up to deliver the nice to know stuff. So we didn't put into the main presentation all the nice to know stuff, but that nice to know stuff can be really valuable to the client if it's delivered at the right time to the right people. And we also need to look at continuous projects. How are we going to go back to the client to follow up on a report that maybe we've been doing for them for 4 or 5 years? We need to find out which pages are actually being read, what decisions are they making, how could we make it easier, how could we reduce the size of the report, what do we need to add to the report. So scheduling follow-ups for one-off studies, scheduling follow-ups for repeat studies is a really key part of the communication process. The communication does not finish when you've done the main debrief. So maybe that was all too long and you didn't read it all. So the key points. You have to know what is the do. What is it you think the recipient of this presentation, this story, should do afterwards? If you don't know, they are not going to know. Be braver. Make a clear recommendation. Try to get the outcome that you think should happen to happen. What blockers might stop the do? And the most common blocker is they're not going to believe this because it's not what they wanted to hear. So we're going to have to tackle that. Another blocker might be it's simply too complicated. So we need to make it simpler. Another blocker might be it's not memorable enough. So we need to make it more memorable. We identified the blockers so that the story delivers the do, it avoids the blockers, and it's going to utilize feel. Now, if we are delivering good news, we don't need to do very much about the feel because they are going to feel that it's right. Where the feel becomes much more explicit is where we are delivering results that the client did not want to hear. Then we are going to have to work out how to make them feel this is right and how to make them feel they ought to do the do we are recommending. And after we have delivered the report, we're going to follow up. We're going to follow up to find out whether it was understood. We're going to follow up to find out if there are any more questions. We're going to follow up to find out if the do happened. And if the do didn't happen, we want to know why. Was it that we didn't push hard enough? Was it that there were other factors at play? Because we want to get better at delivering the do from project to project. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.